Hello and good morning, my fellow learners. My name is Juan Jose Gutierrez, and this is SBS200 Introduction to Social Sciences with some interest in English communication. By all means, this is your Income A class for the semester. Okay, so we're going to be talking today about psychology, society, and culture. That is, what's the relationship between the individual and the society? This has been a major question in social sciences for the duration of the 20th century, and we're still going at it in the 21st. Some of the items that we're going to be exploring today, as proposed by our textbook, are the following. First, socialization in the individual, which is the questions that relate to the extent to which each of us are the result of just our genetic makeup, or whether and to what extent the social context and the cultural context shape the way we think, the way we move, the way we perceive of things. Really interesting questions. The second one is related to personality and its development, because personality would be a central concept in order to understand then society. You cannot understand, some would say, the aggregation of individuals, if you don't have a good solid sense of what personality is. A third element that we're going to be exploring is the very concept of intelligence, personal adjustment, and normality. Normality, and deviance as the counterpart are key central components of theories that are interested in law and society. So for any of you that have any inkling or interest in becoming police officers, law enforcement officers, these should be topics that really grab your attention and are of importance to you. So we're going to be exploring some of those elements that define what is normal and what is abnormal or deviant, for that matter. Lastly, we're going to be exploring psychological and biological explanations of deviance. So once we know what is deviance and we have explored what is deviance and normalcy, we're going to be looking into those psychological and certainly biological explanations for deviance, because in order to harness the beast, we shall understand it. Okay, so let's get started. First and foremost, socialization in the individual. To have a full understanding of the relationship between individuals and society, it is helpful to have a clear concept of the meaning of personality, as I was indicating. So what is personality? It has been said that every human being is in some respects like all others, in some respects like some others, and in so many respects like no others. And in like so many respects like no others. Think of it for a second. So we have things universal that are common to everyone. So we have a sense of self, without which we wouldn't be individuals. We have a sense of the others. We have means of communicating. We have emotions. All those things are human universals, right? But then they also tell us that in some respects we're like some others. My emotions, my sentiments, my likings might be related more pointedly to a certain group of folks than to others. So if you are native of certain countries, you will be very inclined and happy with spicy foods, tongue-burning foods, but not from other places. And that has a lot to do with the environmental factors and cultural factors. So those elements of taste in this case will make you similar to some other peoples, but not to everyone else. So we have that distinction. And then there are elements that in so many respects are like no others. So that's our uniqueness. And that can be really positive, or it can be very strange and deviant. And we will get into this idea of what's deviance and what's normal. But nonetheless, when you're unique in many respects, then that will make you, in that respect, to be like no other. And that's a basic sort of concept to start understanding the relationship between the individual and the other. Where is this coming from? How is this personality and the individual psyche developing over time? Well, over time, scientists, particularly in this case, we're referring to Piaget, which is a French psychologist, they have explored that there's a regular and identified that there's a regular pattern of development in most humans. So when we're born, our species actually pops out individuals that are quite not ready for the world. If you see a cow giving birth or a horse, you can see how that animal immediately stands up and starts grazing, starts living. Whereas in the case of humans, we're quite not ready. Our bones haven't even been, our bodies haven't even been conformed. If you touch the head of a little baby, you'll see that the cranium is not even all together. And certainly our psychological and otherwise abilities are not fully developed. So we go from that stage of lack of defense and ability to stand on our own into being fully adults that are capable of all the things humans are capable of. It's a process, and that process has been explored and documented. In the case of Piaget, he talks about at least 4 different stages of development from birth to 2 years of age, in which mostly we're concerned with physical objects, touching and discovering with our senses the world around us. Then at 2 years, something happens, and our symbolic ability is triggered in phenomenal ways. So that's when we start connecting with the symbolic world that we live surrounded by because of culture. At 6 years of age, we start being more and more entertained and concerned with abstract ideas. For example, we might not have an understanding what is a zero before the age of 6. And I have to tell you, this is why sometimes I'm really worried and horrified at times that parents would like kids to be phenomenal at before 2. They want the kids to be able to read and walk and recite poetry. That doesn't make any sense. We have a developmental trajectory, and that takes some time. So you want kids to be able to do heavy math starting 6, not before that, for example. Why? Because math needs and requires a greater understanding and grasp of abstract concepts and ideas. Okay. Then at 12, from 12 to 15, we have the last stage before adulthood, which is when individuals start understanding the very complex idea of, for example, irony. So you can say one thing because of the inflection of and the way in which you say it, then you have to actually read the opposite. So if someone comes and says, you know, Juan, I think I deserve an A, I can easily say, you're right. I will definitely give you an A by the end of the semester. That individual totally understands that I'm saying, I'm not going to give you an A at the end of the semester unless you do what you have to do to get an A. So that's interesting, because if you think of it, if I tell that to a machine, I'm telling positively that I will assign certain grade, whereas your beautiful minds will really grasp the fact that I'm being ironic, and I'm actually meaning quite the opposite. What do you need to do what kind of a calculation is needed for that? It's pretty complex, and so our brains are those magnificent machines that allow for our minds to make those complex calculations. So back to Piaget, he finds it useful, and when he says useful to divide, he means that maybe there's some tweaking that can be done but for the sake of analysis, he divides the life of the child into 4 stages that I have explained. Let's move on to another interesting topic that it is central to what social sciences explore when they are exploring the relationship between the individual and the society, and that would be the so-called nature-nurture debate. That is, to what extent who we are and what we do comes from our genetic makeup, nature, or nurture from our cultural context. I'm going to play a short clip on explaining this divide by using the examples of twins. So you have twins that are genetically identical, and nonetheless they develop through time. Even though we try to make them to continue being equal, we know that twins are always somewhat different. So here we go.
Identical twins start out as a bizarre accident. As with the rest of us, when sperm meets egg, an individual is formed. But then something remarkable happens. The single developing embryo splits to form two identical people. So it's not surprising, since they started out as one person, that they're so much alike. But similarity is boring, scientifically speaking. It's really the differences that are the thin end of the wedge. They allow us to get inside the nature of all our lives. Corey and Eric are, believe it or not, identical. Yet Eric is much bigger than Corey and has been since he was born. Next to their older brother Tyler, you'd think there were three brothers of different ages.
He's bigger than him. And I'm bigger than him. And my head's bigger than Corey's. He doesn't like when I punch him. I love him. Punch me right now.
The differences between twins begin to appear almost from conception. It's not fair, but one twin often gets the lion's share of nutrition in the womb. Corey and Eric's case is severe, and that's why Corey came out so much smaller. And the effects of being malnourished as a fetus can persist into adulthood. At the University of Louisville, they've been studying twins for over 40 years. Hundreds of twins have passed through here. Corey and Eric have been visiting the university since they were born. Here, they are regularly weighed, measured, and they have their IQ tested.
Weigh 44.5 pounds.
Other than the fact that one of them is taller than the other one, they're as much alike as any pair of identical twins for the basic building blocks, intelligence, personality, and temperament that we see in any of these pairs.
Now, look at this puzzle.
The biggest single factor in determining intelligence is our genes. But environmental influences such as food, education, and most of all parents can have important stimulating or stunting effects.
Tell me when you're finished.
When Corey was first tested, he was not only shorter than Eric, he also had a lower IQ. The remedy was that both twins got lots of stimulation at home and at the institute. Corey's IQ score rose fast. Eric's didn't. Now they have similar scores.
First.
What this research shows is that intelligence is like height. Without proper stimulation, you'll never reach your genetic potential. But equally, if you're already there, you probably won't go much higher. It's an example of the value of twins to science. Plainly, we could design an experiment like this for rats, but not for humans. It would be too cruel.
So if you want to make a prediction about a twin's intelligence by the time they reach their adult years, your best prediction can be made on the basis of how far the mother and the father went to school.
It seems you can't make children taller or smarter than they are programmed to be. Like athletic ability, intelligence can certainly be nurtured. But unless it's already in the genes, serenading your baby with Mozart is not going to make it into a genius.
Okay, interesting video, I would think. So personality, it's a critical component of us understanding the actual integration of society. It gotta make sense. You cannot understand society without understanding the individuals, right? As I was explaining before. Now, if personality is central to understanding society, so we also need to understand what is the relationship between culture and that personality. To what extent, as the debate between nature and nurture was leaning towards, to what extent culture is that context that generates the idea of or the personality of individuals. Culture, on the one hand, is the result of number of individuals' creation, and then it's a loop that fits in itself, because then culture creates individuals that will in turn recreate culture. So culture is created by individuals, and then the individual personalities are shaped and molded by culture. There are a number of elements of interest in this aspect of the relationship between culture and society, culture and the individual. Had to do with, one, the extent to which the potentialities of the individual are simply inherited or are shaped by culture. Second, what do we mean by natural environment? We talk about natural environment of the individual. It's difficult for me and probably for you to try to think of a natural environment that is not embedded at the same time in culture, the world we live today. This idea of a pristine environment in which humans live in the midst of only nature, it's non-existent. I don't think that it ever was existing. I think actually humans are become humans as a species because of the emergence of culture as well. So I think both came at the same time. But if we agree that each individual has and moves and thrives in a specific culture, then we need to explore what is that culture for each individual's and for each individual's society. We normally talk about a nation or a society, and within that nation or society, we will find a number of cultures. Think of your nation and the many, many different cultures that coexist together in this place that we call the United States, right? And then also it's important to remind us that cultures do not create automatic responses from individuals, and or does not create or model individuals that are all exactly alike. Within those cultures, within those societies, we have unique personal experiences and unique responses and unique identities. Let's now move to another topic that is also quite interesting and that I announced a few minutes ago, this idea of intelligence and normality. One of the society's tasks is to coordinate the actions of millions of individuals so that they can live together. If we drive on a road, on one side of the road, that has to do with the norms and ideas that were once crafted by other individuals that created that culture that we now live in. Fortunately, we know that we have to drive in the States on certain side of the road. I believe it's the right one, and not on the left one. And that makes us safer and capable of coming to class on time, for example. Society's way of doing this is developing norms. The way society enable us to stay together, stick together, is because we have norms. And when we violate those norms, then we come to a realm of inappropriate behavior or unacceptable behavior. So when we deviate from the norm is to drive on the right side of the road, then that becomes abnormal behavior, unexpected behavior. And so there's nothing intrinsic essential about the norm. It was very random that we decided to drive on the right side and not the left as they drive in say England, for example. There's nothing essential to it. But once we adopt that norm, then we become used to expect that everyone will abide by the norm as a way of also sticking together. Imagine traffic otherwise. So when we disrespect the norms and violate the norms, then that becomes abnormal behavior or deviance. When you are tested for certain for intelligence, what they are doing is actually telling you what we expect that you would do falls within this realm, this bracket of responses, and that will make of your intelligence normal or abnormal. And that's what the IQ score would be. So you are normal just not because there's something intrinsically abnormal or normal to your behavior, but because that's exactly what most people in your group is expected and actually does. So when you take an IQ test and you rank really high, normal, or not normal, below normal, I don't think you have to take that personally for a number of reasons. But that so when you take an IQ exam and you score as above normal, normal, or under the score of normal, you shouldn't take it personally because the IQ test measures what's going on in one particular moment and in one specific cultural context. What's the real meaning of IQ? That should be the subject of a conversation later on. Mental tests are intended to discover or to measure the mental characteristics of an individual. We have been interested in gauging to what extent we are similar or different from the others from a long time. And one of the examples that are presented by the book that I found quite interesting is the case of Ulysses when he's trying not to tend to the state. It wasn't the government; it was the city's authorities called to arms. He didn't want to go, so he acted crazy, right? But they actually tested him, as the book narrates, and they found him quite sane and ready to go to arms. And then, thanks to that going, we have the wonderful Odyssey, in which we will learn about the story of Ulysses. So we've been testing, and all it will place you in the context of what's the mean, what's the normal in any given society. Let's now explore with this short clip that I'm inserting here the different theories of deviance as narrated by Professor Erin Cole in a clip that I found in YouTube and I found to be quite useful. Here we go.
Transmission theory, social disorganization theory, and labeling theory. So the first theory is control theory. And what this theory says is that our connection to other members of society leads us to conform to society's norms. Socialization develops our self-control so that we don't need further pressure to obey social norms, and we are socialized to want to belong and fear being viewed as deviant. Right, so what this theory says is that our bonds to people in our lives, our family, our friends, our peers, induces us to follow the norms of our society. Right, so when you were in the store, why did you pay for your items as opposed to just putting them in your pocket and walking out? Why do people follow the rules? And it's because that we don't want to disappoint our families, we don't want to embarrass our families, and we're socialized from a very young age to follow the rules. Most people, most of the time, so that it comes to the point where we just internalize it and we don't even think about it. right? And despite media portrayals, most people in society obey the basic norms most of the time, right? We want to see ourselves as being loyal, cooperative, and responsible. So control theory doesn't focus on why people are deviant. It focuses on why most people most of the time follow the rules. Our second theory is Durkheim's theory of deviance. And Durkheim's theory of deviance is broken down into two parts. And the first part is, how do we define deviance? How do we determine what is outside of the norms? Or, what is criminal? And Durkheim says that nothing is criminal unless we decide it is. Right? There is nothing inherently deviant or criminal in any act. The key is how society responds to this act. So he says we must not say that an action shocks the common consciousness because it's criminal, but rather it is criminal because it shocks that consciousness, right? Nothing is criminal or worthy of condemnation unless we decide it is, right? So something like murder, we think, murder taking a person's life is just naturally wrong. But however, if you do it in self-defense, then it could be excused. If you do it in a time of war, you can be rewarded for it. So when we look at deviance, it's society that determines what is right and what is wrong. Right? There's no natural law defining what is right and what is wrong. Right? The second part of his theory is that there are many functions to deviance. And the first one is, identifying acts as deviant helps us clarify our beliefs and values and brings us closer together, right? We need to see people being deviant in order to determine what is right and wrong. Secondly, punishment draws people together against the offender, right? When someone is captured or someone is sentenced or someone is executed, right, it brings people together. It brings in a sense of community. We see, how social media is playing this thing out. Sanctions discourage violations and increase conformity. If proper acts aren't sanctioned, people are going to push the limits, right? If, nobody was, if cops didn't patrol the highways and stop people for speeding, people would speed all the time, right? If there was no repercussions for stealing, people would steal all the time, right? So we need sanctions in place because otherwise people will push the limits. And when we ourselves are sanctioned or we see somebody else sanctioned, it tends to increase that conformity. And then deviance forces us to recognize the limits of our existing beliefs and practices and opens up new doors and leads to cultural innovation, right? So sometimes we need people to be deviant in order to have social change, right? Rosa Parks, her deviant act of not moving to the back of the bus, we're looking at the beginning of the civil rights movement. We look at, any time when we have social change, it has to start with people being deviant first, and testing the limits of what's going on in our society. So that's Durkheim's theory. Merton's theory of deviance is also known as strain theory. And this views deviance as an adaptation of socially prescribed goals or the means of governing their attainment or both. So it looks at what is the end goal of deviant behavior. And it says, behavior that violates accepted social norms may be performed with the same basic objective as those who pursue more conventional lifestyles. Right? So we look at this. Who is this? Walter White. In season 1 Walter White, not season 4 Walter White. For any of you who watched the TV show Breaking Bad, right? What is the same basic objective that Walter White had when he was a chemistry teacher and when he made crystal meth? Right, the end goal was to make money to be able to provide for his family, and because of his cancer and his inability to continue to provide for his family, that's why he made the decision that he was going to make meth instead of just being a chemistry teacher. But at the end of the day, it's the same basic objective, right? And this is what Merton's theory looks at. It says, what do a bank robber and a teacher have in common? At the end of the day, they're just trying to get money. And we look at, U.S. society, the U.S. measures success by money. So therefore, people are going to adapt in certain situations in order to get this money, right? Some people do it by, going to school and getting jobs and getting careers and getting money that way. And then other people do it by robbing or selling drugs or any other means. But at the end of the day, we're looking at, the same basic objectives. A teenager who deals drugs or a teenager who works as a busboy after school. And sometimes a disconnect can exist between society's goals and the means that people have to attain them, which is why it's called strain theory. When people are under strain, they tend to, commit deviant acts in order to get to the same outcome. The fourth theory is cultural transmission theory, and this says that individuals learn criminal behavior by interacting with others. Right? Nobody is a natural born criminal. Right? No one, is born knowing how to pick pockets or know how to make and sell drugs. This is a learned behavior, right? So if we look in comparison to control theory, where we look at how most people are conditioned to obey the basic rules, some people are taught to disobey the rules and to engage in criminal behavior, right? So we learn criminal behavior. We learn the behavior itself, but we also learn the motives and the drives and the rationalizations, everything that goes into this criminal behavior. And it's a process, and the process itself is called differential association. And this is, the process where once we're exposed to the attitudes that are favorable to the criminal acts, this leads us to the violations. So people are more likely to engage in norm-defying behavior if they're a part of a group or a subculture that stresses these deviant values. So we look at this process, especially when we look at teenagers who start to associate with a bad crowd. First they just start interacting with others, and then, as they're learning the attitudes and continue to interact, that things seem less out of the ordinary, seems less taboo. And that's why teens especially, might engage in behavior that they might not have otherwise if they were associating with a different group. So it's definitely a very learned behavior. Some, people teach their children from a very young age how to steal or sell drugs or things like that, right? So looking at this, how it's a very learned behavior. The fifth theory is called social disorganization theory, and this doesn't look at why, people so much commit crimes. It looks at, what the situation is that contributes to higher crime rates. So it looks at neighborhoods, and, and it asks the question, why is crime higher in some neighborhoods than others? So it attributes these increases in crimes and deviance to the absence or the breakdown of communal relationships and institutions. And when we talk about communal relationships and institutions, we're talking about families, schools, churches. So, it looks at how when people are not connected to the community, right, when we don't have good schools that are teaching our children, when we don't have, healthy, supportive, intact families, when we don't have religious organizations and community organizations that are involved in these neighborhoods, this is why we have higher crime rates, right? So, it looks at how the lack of these community connections make it difficult to exert social control, especially over children. You know that old adage, like it takes a village to raise a child. Well, when the village isn't there, we could see how behavior can escalate. So it says, without community supervision and controls, playing outside becomes the opportunity for deviance. Older children are the ones that are influencing the younger children, and crimes become a normal response to a local context. Right? So we look at, when we say neighborhood characteristics, what exactly do we mean? So when we see neighborhoods with high poverty rates, high unemployment rates, racial and ethnic heterogeneity, which means that lots of different races and ethnicities living together, high residential turnover, meaning, people are moving in and out on a rotating basis, so people are not, placing their, what's the word I'm looking for? They're anchors in the community. People are constantly moving. Nobody knows each other. And then we have this, the big pieces, these social institutions, the family, schools, churches, community organizations. When they're weak, they're unable to regulate the behavior of the neighborhood's youth. And the textbook talks about an experiment that Dr. Zimbardo engaged in, where they abandoned a car in two different neighborhoods and saw how it played out, which ties into the social disorganization theory. So take a look at that in your textbook. And then our sixth theory is labeling theory, which is also called societal reaction theory. And this theory does not look at why people commit crimes. It looks at how people view certain people who commit crimes, right? So the emphasis is not on the people committing the acts, the emphasis on the agents of social control. So it explains why certain individuals are viewed as deviant, while others who are engaged in the same exact behavior are not. So it emphasizes how a person comes to be labeled and, over time may actually accept that label. Right? So the textbook looks at the difference between the saints and the roughnecks when they were going out and committing these deviant acts, and how the same act was interpreted differently based on whether the kids were viewed as being saints or as they were viewed as being roughnecks. One of the other examples of this is racial profiling, which is informally known as driving while black, right? Looking at, the same behavior that is treated differently. And we look at the role of power and how people in power can shape what is continued to be considered deviant. Um, in, um, in this activity.
All right, so those are the 6 of the theories of deviance that you should take into consideration, and that most people that are interested in normalcy and deviance would explore and use to explain certain different things or different aspects of deviance in social sciences. Insofar as the biological basis of deviance, there's also a really interesting proposition from the book in that that should help us understand whether or not there are certain individuals with certain propensities to behave abnormally, that is, to behave outside the confines of what most people would consider the norm in action. Before finishing this lesson, I just want to bring to your attention the different aspects that you should be able to address as a result of your work with this chapter and in this week. First of all, I want you to pay attention to what's the relationship between culture and personality, to what extent one creates the other or vice versa. Then we want you to be alert as to the nature and nurture divide. That is, what is that explains our behavior? Is this nature? Is this culture or nurture? Some aspects of psychological theories of reinforcement, like positive and negative reinforcement. The chapter also brings 2 theories that I didn't address this morning, which is the Maslow's hierarchy and then the difference between ego and superego as defined by Freud, the very famous psychologist of the late 19th century, early 20th century. Then IQ. I want you to be able to indicate how IQ is calculated, and also want to get your reaction as to what does this measurement really means. And last but not least, the very concept of deviance that I think is a fascinating one, and that has been the core of a large branch of sociological theory and thought throughout time, and certainly in the 20th and 21st century. All right, with this, I complete my presentation, and I look forward to hearing your mindful comments on the different aspects of this presentation. Take care.